Welcome. In this lesson, we will be working with list boxes. After reviewing this lesson, you will be able to include a list box in an interface, initialize the collection of a list box, add items to the collection, delete items from the collection, and sort the collection. Let's explore the fundamentals of the list box control. So here I have an application with a couple list boxes on it. And list boxes are a little more powerful and more useful than simple multi-line text boxes because list boxes are associated with a collection. So we have the items collection of list box. And collections are powerful because they have built into them the methods to add elements to the list, to delete elements to the list, to sort the list, and otherwise do other kinds of list management type things. So they're really, really convenient. Such things would be selecting one or more elements of the list. So we can identify the elements as we can in an array, which we'll study a little bit more in upcoming lessons, by the index or the number of the element or the record in the list, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. Or we can just refer to it by its content: sneezy, sleepy, happy, grumpy, dopey, doc, or bashful. Okay, so hopefully you're sold on the idea that the items collection makes things really powerful. Let's see how we get our initial list into the collection. And so on this, I'm listed the names of the 8 dwarves from Disney. So that's my Disney Dwarves collection, I suppose. And if I come over to the properties for the list box and look at the collection, there is an ellipsis here. If I click on it, you can see that it says enter the strings in the collection, one per line, and that's what I've done. I've added the 7 dwarves. So there we go. And that's one way to populate them. We'll look shortly at another way to populate that. And I should also mention that beyond what we're going to study in our lessons, list boxes can be very powerful because they don't have to be populated statically at design time or depending only on user input. We'll learn how to populate them with file content, but they can also be bound to database queries, which is very, very powerful. You can partner your application with a database engine on the back end, so you can have access to enormous amounts of data through the lens of our data-bound list box. So again, you'll address that in more advanced, intermediate and advanced programming classes. All right, so let's take a look at beyond initializing that, which we do with the collection property, the items property on the collection through the ellipsis. Let's take a look at this app in operation and what it does, and we'll look at the sorted property and explore that just a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and run this app and see how it works. So my app has run and I have a list box here, which is the main list. I have a secondary list box here that I'm going to show the item or items that are currently selected. And really, those could be shown just as easily by the fact that they're highlighted. But I thought it would be fun to show that up so we can see the different selection modes that can be made. This is the simple select one. I can only have one selected, and when I select another one, it replaces it. And of course, sorting isn't very interesting when you only have one, so we'll leave that off for right now. Multi-simple property set to true, or if the sort method is set to, or selection method is set to multi-simple, then I can simply click on one or more and click the ones that are selected that I want to unclick, and I get my selection. Now that I have a list here, you can see what happens when I change the sorted property, and that property is pertaining to this the currently selected list box that I'm showing here, I'm not going to sort the main list. Bam, and there it is, and unsorted and sorted. So pretty straightforward. All right, we'll explore some additional features in the ListBox in the next video. Now let's look at some other ways to populate the list box, or at least to provide the initial collection of items for a list box. And so we've seen one way, which was at design time through the visual interface to come into the items collection, hit the ellipsis, and then we can enter the list here. We can also do this programmatically, and by adding each item with a .add method. The challenge here is, where do we put that? So what would be a good event that is going to fire off before the user is likely to want to interact with the list box? So it will be populated right up front when the user goes to use the program. Well, probably the best place for that is in the Form.Load event. We can get there very quickly by double-clicking on the form itself. And here I have commented out the add statements to call the add function, which is a function of the items object, so of the collection, and of the ListBox instance, in this case, ListBox dwarves, LB dwarves. Okay, and I've added each of the items. So let's go ahead and uncomment that. And of course, we don't want to have them in there twice. So now we need to come back over to our initial design, go into the design element, and remove the list here. So now the collection will start empty. The program loads, initializes. When the form loads, it calls the Form.Load event. And at that point, each of the items will be added. And when the form is rendered, they should all appear. Let's see if that works. And there it is. All of our dwarves right where we want them. So again, just to double check, now the dwarves list box in the visual interface, again, the collection is empty. We're building that dynamically in the Form.Load. We're going to be using Form.Load extensively as we do more and more programming, because there's a whole bunch of housekeeping we'll be wanting to do in preparation of the user beginning to interact with the program. And so the Form.Load event is handy for that, for a whole multitude of tasks. Let's look at other features of the collection, the add method and the delete method. We sort of foreshadowed the add method in our Form.Load event discussion, because we used the add item to add to the collection. And so this is pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at the code for adding a dwarf. And so one of the things that I'm doing here is adding the text that's found in the new dwarf text box to the collection, and that'll just add at the end. And then the other thing I'm doing, once that's been added, I'm setting the button back to blank. And so or not the button, excuse me, the text box back to blank. So once it's been added, it empties that out and gets it ready to accept a new entry. And so that's pretty straightforward. It's just the here's the object, the list box of dwarves. On the items object, there's the add method, and so it just adds it to the list. So all the list management routines are kind of provided for us as a feature of the control. Pretty nice. Let's take a look and see how delete works very similarly. So the only thing I've added in here is, delete is a loaded gun. Once it's gone, it's gone. So I put in a message box and said, hey, are you really certain that you want to do that? and it's a yes/no message box. And so it will, if yes is pressed, it returns a true, and if no is clicked, it returns false. And so if we take a look here, what that if does, it says if message box all this stuff. Well, this message box is going to return true for yes and false for no. So if this is true, then we're going to go ahead and do it. If the answer is no, I'm not even providing anything in the else. There's no else clause in this. It just, does nothing and ignores things. So you changed your mind. That's fine. You just back out and no more to be said. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward. And let's see. I also have a do while in here. What's that about? So we're asking if you want to delete, and we're going to do while the dwarves selected item count is greater than 0. So we're going to delete everything that's selected, which this is kind of, I don't know, extraneous when we only have the one select mode turned on. There's only ever going to be one, so we really, this loop is not going to repeat. But this, putting this in a loop says, hey, if you have multiple selection enabled, so either the multi-extended or the multi-simple, so that more than one thing may be selected, go through each item that's selected and remove them one at a time. It'd be nice, since we've got sort of a sub list or collection, if we could just say, hey, take the whole selected items list and delete all those items. Yeah, maybe next time, Microsoft. That's not the way that, or it's not a feature that's been provided. We have to go in and pull them out one at a time. So something to look forward to and an improvement in the future. Or maybe you code up your own custom control when you learn a little bit more VB programming and are building your own custom controls. Yes, you can build the controls that we use as well. So once you start building that, maybe you can improve upon it. Until then, we pull them out one at a time. And when they're all out of the list, then we go ahead and end the subroutine. So let's see this in operation. Go ahead and run our program. Okay, and so notice that I have the add dwarf button initially is disabled because there's nothing in here. I don't want to add blank dwarfs. So if I start typing something, the button is enabled, and I'm looking at the change event, the text change event on this text box, and every time it fires, I pose the question, hey, is it not null? Is it not the empty string? If it's the empty string, that button goes back to being disabled. If there's something in here, then we can add it. So let's see, we've got a bunch of Disney dwarves. Let's have some Tolkien dwarves in here. So the Great Thorin Oakenshield and Bifur and Boffer. Great, so now we've got some Tolkien dwarves, and now let's select what we want to get rid of, and let's turn multi-simple on, and this would be a great time. I don't think I completely demonstrated how multi-extended work. So multi-extended, if you are not touching any of the keys, it looks like it's single, right? So it's sort of like single in this mode, but if I hold the shift key down, it will and click on Dopey, it automatically selects everything from the first thing I had selected down to the bottom thing that I just indicated. So for instance, we can go from happy to hold the shift key down dock and get them all in one shot. The other thing I can do with multi-extended is hold the shift key down and get more than one. Or if I want to get non-contiguous, non-adjacent dwarfs, hold the control key down and click on some of the dwarves, but not all the dwarves. And then I can click them again if they're selected to unclick them. And so there. Now I've selected all of the Disney dwarves, and you could have them sorted alphabetically. And then I click on delete selected, and this message box comes up entitled Svartalfheim, which is in Norse mythology. That's the afterworld for the dwarves, where all good little dwarvish boys and girls go when they're sent to the afterlife. So let's send them to Svartalfheim, yes, and bam, they are gone. Okay, and then unfortunately Thorin didn't make it, so we're going to send him as well. Delete selected. Yeah, but let's say I'm only in book 2 of the trilogy, or actually that was The Hobbit, right? So I'm in the middle of the Hobbit book, so I'll say no, he can hang in there for a few more chapters and nothing is done there, right? And I can even come back and um, control and click on him and unselect him, and so now I don't have anything selected. And notice when there's nothing selected, there's nothing here to be added because I haven't started typing, but if there's nothing selected, the delete selected button is also disabled, and we'll take a look at how we're doing that. Okay. So let's take a quick look at some of the magic behind the scenes and give yourself a little self-test. What would I be doing? What is the event that would cause delete selected to be enabled or the delete selected button to be disabled? So if you think about it, anytime I have something more than 0 things in the selected list, I want this button to be enabled. And anytime I have nothing selected, then I want it to be disabled. And where would that happen? So let's go ahead and just get the form open and start looking, or the code behind the form open, start looking at that. And so when the selected index has changed, so the thing that I am selecting, here's the ListBox selected items is cleared. The uh, uh, selected items are then added to the other list box. The list of selected items shows up in the other list box. And if the count is more than 0, then I'm taking that delete button and enabling it. And if it is not more than 0, so there's 0 or you can't have less, so it's basically going to be 0, then it's going to be false that button is enabled. So the button is disabled. So that's where we're toggling that button on and off. We're doing something similar when we are in the text box for the add items. So if the length of the text in the text box is greater than 0, we're going to enable that button. And if it's 0, then that button is going to be disabled. There's nothing to add. So we won't add a dwarf that has no name or a length of 0 characters in it. So there we go. At this point, we've basically covered all the fundamentals of list boxes, and your lesson is done. So you could tune this out at this point and you will have all the essentials. But I thought if you'd like to see a little bit more, something a little more challenging, I'd throw in an expert for experts, or extra for experts corner, and that has to do with something clever that's being done in the code here when we are changing the code from sorted to unsorted. So just to refresh our memories, let's run that again, and multi-simple. Let's choose a whole bunch of dwarves here, and notice that we changed the attribute to sorted. And this is a separate list box. This is a selected list box. We have populated it by walking through each of the selected items in the collection of the dwarves list box and adding them to the selected list box. And so here they are. And when we change the property of this list box to sorted, they are in alphabetical order. Now, ordinarily, unchecking this would not result in the list going back to its natural unsorted order. The list just gets left alone. If we click it again, sorted, no change would result because it is sorted. So what am I doing that is causing this to go from the sorted list back to the original? Well, the sneaky thing that I'm doing here is when you unclick sorted, I am going back and repopulating this. I'm clearing the list box and I'm repopulating it again by going and getting these in their unsorted order. Okay, now that's not really the clever thing that I'm doing here. The clever thing that I'm doing is we already had some code that does that. Okay, what is the code that populates this selected list box with the selected items from the first list box? Well, it's the event handler for the selected item changed over in the dwarves list box. Now, since I've already written code to do that once, the clever thing here is don't write it again. There's an event handler, but that event handler is wired in that it is fired off anytime you change the selected dwarves. How on earth are we going to make that code over here fire when this object is changed to empty, unchecked? Okay, well, it turns out that any event handler that you create can be called again from elsewhere in your code. It's an event handler, but it's also a subroutine. And we haven't really discussed functions or subroutines to a great extent this part. So that's why this is an extra for experts, but I thought it might interest you. So let's take a look and see how that is working and what would happen if I didn't do it that way. So here's my check changed event handler on the check sorted, the checkbox. So anytime the checkbox is changed, this event gets called. And what I'm doing is I'm toggling whatever the sorted state. Sorted is either true or false. So if the selected list box sorted property was true, it becomes false. So it becomes not whatever it was. If it was false, it becomes not false, which is to say it's true. And that is the essential piece. But if that's all we did, it will not go and unsort the list. Let's comment out this next line before we look at it too hard and see that that's true. Okay, multi-simple, select, 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 select. Okay, sorted and unclick sorted. And now, although the property of this list box is unsorted, it didn't dynamically like randomize them. It just left them alone. When I click it back to sorted, it did sort them again, but they were already in sorted order, so it didn't really change. So once sorted, it doesn't, keep a track of how they were originally, in some other order. Doesn't keep track of the original order, so it doesn't put them back. So how can we get that? Oh, well, they're still in unsorted order here, and they're still selected here. So we can go and call the subroutine, the handler for the dwarves list box, so list box dwarves, and we had coded up selected index changed. Now, we've already got a sender object, and we've got the event arguments object, because sender and event args, we don't pay attention to these most of the time. This is just passed to us by the Windows system. And so, whatever the sender was, that's what it was. Whatever the arguments were, that's what they were. We don't really need to change them here. So I'm just reusing them, sender and E, and I'm calling the existing subroutine. Now, I had another choice, and that is I could have replicated the code for this selected index changed event and duplicated it, but why maintain the code in two places? If I ever change it one place, I'll have to remember to change it in the other place. That's not a good situation. And so, and why create more complexity? The simpler the code, the better and the more reliable it will be, and the more, we're going to have a certain percentage of errors per 10,000 lines. Every programmer has some sort of error rate, and we can usually express that at least 1 in 10,000 lines of code, right, in their logic. So the fewer lines I have, the less likely I am to run into whatever my personal error rate is. So the more likely my code is to be error-free, or at least have fewer errors in it because there's fewer lines of code. So that's just brutal statistics for quality control of software engineering, if you like. Okay, someone doing their doctoral program, there's a dissertation in there. Go dig it out. But in the meantime, we just call this routine and it does what we want, and that is so when it goes to the opposite of whatever it was, it's going to come and put them into repopulate that list box. If we had gone from false to true, so they're sorted, in putting them in the list box, because the list box has the sorted property set, it will sort them for us. If not, if we've just checked it off, so now the checkbox is off, the property is not sorted, so it's going to leave them in whatever their native order was that we imported them from the original selected list of dwarves, from the LB dwarves list box. Okay, so with that restored, we run our code again, and now we can kind of see it happening. Multi-select. Let's select a few dwarves here. And sorted, that much is really intuitive. And here's where the magic happens. So when we unclick this list box gets wiped out. It goes back and re-adds one at a time. Just happens so fast we can't see it. All of these, and since they're added in the order that we walk down the selected list, when we do the adds, and the sorted property is not true, it looks like we have restored them to their unsorted version, which essentially we have. We've just done it in a sort of underhanded way. Clever, right? There you go. This concludes the lesson.